There is a young man lying on a bed at 2 in the afternoon, in a room with the curtains drawn. And the worst part is not the dark. The worst part is that he was built for exactly the opposite of this. 8 months ago, his body was a machine he could trust with his life, a body that had won things, that had crossed lines in front of crowds who screamed his name, that had a knee. And then on an ordinary Tuesday, on a surface he had run across 10,000 times, that knee folded sideways in a way knees are not supposed to fold. And now there is a long pink scar where the certainty used to be, and a stillness in him that no one around him can stand. His coach calls it a slump. His father calls it feeling sorry for yourself. The team doctor cleared the joint weeks ago and cannot understand why the rest of him will not get up. They are all asking the same impatient question, the one he has started asking himself in a voice that sounds like theirs. What is wrong with you? Why won't you fight this? And here is the thing none of them can see, the thing that is the whole reason for what follows. The heaviness pinning him to that bed is not the enemy. It is not the breakdown of a strong man. It is the most intelligent thing his psyche has done in years. And every ounce of force he and everyone who loves him is throwing at it to make it stop is the exact reason it will not lift. Carl Jung understood that there are collapses that are not failures of will at all. They are the psyche pulling the energy down and backward on purpose, drowning the old life so a truer one has room to grow, and the harder you fight the descent, the longer the descent has to hold you down to finish its work. By the end of this, you will understand why some of the lowest periods of a life are not malfunctions to be defeated, but movements to be honored. Why the energy that drains out of everything you used to love is not vanishing, but going somewhere underground, and why the frantic effort to climb back up to who you were is often the one thing keeping you sick. You will learn what Jung saw beneath the surface of depression, that almost no one else in his century was willing to see, and how a collapse can become the foundation of a self far deeper than the one that fell. But there is a part of this that is harder than the lying in the dark, a turn that almost no one is willing to make, and it is this. The version of you that you are straining so desperately to get back may be precisely the version that has to die, and your loyalty to him is what is breaking your heart. If this is already touching something in you, some flat gray stretch you have been calling a failure, I would ask you to do one small thing before we go down into it together. Leave a comment about a low period in your life that you fought as hard as you could, and tell me, honestly, whether the fighting helped or whether something only shifted when you finally stopped. Not for sympathy, but because naming it out loud changes the way it sits inside you. If this speaks to a season you are in right now, let me know with a like so I know to keep making these. And if there is someone you love who is lying in their own dark room while everyone tells them to snap out of it, send this to them, because it might be the first time anyone has suggested that the dark is not the disease. Let me tell you properly about the athlete, because his whole life is the shape of what is happening to him now. And you cannot read the collapse without reading the rise that made it inevitable. He is 26. He started running before he can remember choosing to, the way some children are simply pointed at a thing and never allowed to stop facing it. By 9, he was winning. By 14, he was the local prodigy, the kid whose name the coaches said in a particular tone. And somewhere in those years, without anyone deciding it on purpose, a quiet equation got written into the deepest part of him, the kind of equation that runs your whole life from underneath without ever once announcing itself. I am what I can do. I am worth what I win. The body performs. Therefore, the boy exists. He did not believe this consciously. He lived it, which is far more total than belief. Every ribbon, Every record, every roar from the stands poured into the same hungry place, and the place was never filled, because a place like that cannot be filled from the outside. It can only be fed. So picture what the injury actually did to him, because it was never only a knee. In the space of one badly planted step, the entire structure he had built himself on simply went dark, not damaged, dark. The thing he did, the only proof he had ever had that he was real, was taken away from him in front of everyone, and into the silence where the performance used to be came a question he had spent 20 years outrunning. If I am not the one who wins, then who exactly is lying in this bed? And he had no answer, because he had never once been required to have one. The running had answered it for him every single day since he was a child, and now the running was gone, and the answer was gone with it. And what flooded into that vacancy was the gray, heavy, motionless weight that the doctors want to call depression, and that everyone around him wants to call weakness. This is where Jung hands us the first piece of the map, and it overturns almost everything the culture has taught you to believe about a collapse like this. For most of the modern world, depression is purely an enemy, a malfunction, a chemical mistake, or a failure of grit, a thing whose only meaning is that it should not be there and must be eliminated as fast as possible. Jung did not see it that way, or rather, he did not see only that. He watched, in patient after patient, a pattern that the simple disease model could not explain. He saw that very often the heaviness arrived not at random, but precisely when a person's conscious life had become too narrow, too one-sided, built too completely on a single foundation that had stopped being true. And he came to a conclusion that still sounds like heresy. He decided that the psyche, in such moments, was not breaking down. It was deliberately withdrawing its energy from a life that had become a lie, pulling the life force down and inward, away from the exhausted surface, and towards something deeper that had been neglected for years. He had a word for this descent, borrowed from the way energy moves, and the word is regression. But Jung used it in a way almost no one else did. For most thinkers, regression was simply a falling backward, a failure to cope, a retreat to a more childish state, something to be reversed. Jung saw that there was such a thing as a regression that served the whole person, a going down that was not a defeat but a necessity, a pulling of the energy back to its source so that it could be reorganized and sent up again in a new shape. What looks, from the outside and from the panicking ego, like nothing but collapse is sometimes the psyche doing the only intelligent thing left to do, which is to stop pouring fuel into a structure that has outlived its truth and to take that fuel back down into the dark where new structures are built. I would call this the intelligent descent. It is not the absence of movement. It is movement in the one direction the desperate ego refuses to go. Now hold the athlete in your mind against that idea and watch how exactly it fits. For 20 years, every drop of his life energy ran outward and upward into the legs, into the times, into the performance, into the equation that said he was what he could do. The injury did not destroy that energy. It dammed the outward channel. And with the usual exit blocked, the energy did what water does when you dam a river. It did not disappear. It pooled, it rose, and it began to seek the lowest ground, flowing down and back into the depths of him, into all the rooms of himself he had bricked over in the long sprint toward winning. The depression is not the energy gone. It is the energy gone home, into a basement he has never visited, to do work he cannot yet see. And his every frantic attempt to force it back up the old outward channel, to be the runner again by sheer will, is like a man bailing a flooded cellar with a teaspoon while refusing to notice that the flood is the only thing that will ever wash the cellar clean. But to understand why the descent has to happen at all, why it could not simply be skipped, you have to go back, as you almost always do, to where the original equation was carved, because a one-sided life is not a thing a person chooses freely as an adult. It is laid down early, in rooms we had no power to leave. Look into the athlete's childhood, and the whole machinery is there, waiting, before he was old enough to question any of it. His father was a man who had wanted, badly, to be an athlete himself, and had not made it, and had folded that unlived ambition into his son the way such men do, without cruelty and without ever once naming it. The love in that house was real, but it had a current running underneath it, and the boy learned to read the current before he could read words. When he won, the house was warm. When he won, his father's eyes did a particular thing, came alive in a way they did at no other time, and the boy would have walked through fire to make that happen again. When he merely existed, when he simply was a child being a child, the warmth went quiet, nothing was said, nothing had to be. He learned, in the wordless way children learn the deepest things, that he was loved for the winning and tolerated for the rest, and so he quietly arranged to be, as much as humanly possible, only the winning. He amputated the boy who was not fast, and kept the boy who was, because the fast one was the one who got the look. And here is the cruelty and the precision of it both. The very narrowing that won him everything is the narrowing that made the collapse inevitable. A self built on a single pillar stands beautifully right up until the pillar is touched, and then it does not wobble, it falls completely, because there is nothing else holding it up. The boy who pruned himself down to performance grew into a man with no other ground to stand on, and the moment the performance was taken, there was simply no man left, only the gray weight rushing in to fill a space that should have been filled decades ago with a self that was allowed to exist for reasons other than what it could do. The depression is not punishing him for being weak. It is the bill, arriving at last, for a strength that was purchased by exiling everything that was not strong. And the psyche, which keeps accounts the ego knows nothing about, has decided that the debt comes due now, in this dark room, because now is the first time in 20 years the running has been quiet enough for the reckoning to be heard. This is where the trap is set, and it is the most important turn in the whole descent, because the trap is the very thing everyone who loves him is pushing him into. The trap is the fight. From the moment the heaviness arrived, every voice in his life, including the one in his own head, has framed it as an opponent to be beaten. Push through it. Stay positive. Get back in the gym. Don't let it win. And this framing feels like courage, feels like the very grit that made him a champion, which is exactly why it is so deadly here, because the energy has gone down on purpose to do necessary work in the depth. And every act of forcing it back up the old channel is an act of war against his own healing. Jung saw this with terrible clarity. He understood that to fight a regression that the psyche has initiated for a reason is to fight the cure itself, to stand at the top of the stairs the soul is trying to descend and shove it back up, over and over, so that it can never reach the bottom where the new self is being assembled. The resistance does not stop the descent. It only prolongs it, makes it grimmer, drains the person of the energy they need to make the journey, and convinces them that they are failing at the one thing they were never meant to win. Watch how this plays out in the small, daily theater of his life. His father comes by on a Sunday, sits on the edge of the bed, and says, with love, with real and helpless love, that he just needs to decide to get up, that champions are made in moments like this, that the comeback is the best part of the story. And the athlete hears it, and something in him that has obeyed that voice his entire life tries to obey it now, tries to manufacture the old upward drive, and for an hour he forces himself to the gym and moves the weights, and that night he is lower than he has been in weeks, hollowed out, scraped, because he has just spent the last of his depleted energy fighting the one process that was trying to save him. The harder he fights, the worse he gets. And because the fighting is the only response anyone has taught him, the worsening looks like proof that he simply is not fighting hard enough. This is the spiral the descent becomes when it is resisted, and most people live their whole low season inside it, exhausting themselves against a current that was only ever trying to carry them somewhere they needed to go. I want you to meet, for just a moment, the man the athlete could so easily have become, because Jung's files are full of him, and so is every life. And the contrast is what makes the danger real. Think of an older man, a surgeon in his 50s, whose hands had been the whole of him the way the legs had been the whole of the runner, and whose own descent came not through an injury but through a tremor, a small betrayal of the nerves that ended the only thing he had ever been. He fought it exactly as he had been taught to fight, the way the culture applauds, with a discipline that looked from the outside like heroism. He never lay down in the dark. He filled every hour, took up new ventures, manufactured the upward drive by sheer relentless will, and outran the heaviness for years by never once allowing himself to stop and feel for the floor. And here is what the fight cost him, the thing Jung watched happen again and again to the ones strong enough to never surrender. The energy that needed to go down does not simply wait politely to be invited. Damned at every channel, refuse the descent. It does not dissolve. It builds, and it sours, and it comes out sideways, in the body that begins to fail in ways no doctor can name, in the rages that arrive without warning, in the slow gray hardening of a man who has won every battle against his own depths and lost, without ever knowing it, the war for his own life. He did not shatter loudly. He calcified. He became brittle and bright and utterly unreachable, a pillar with nothing behind it. And when the pillar was finally touched a second time, there was no soft ground anywhere in him to break the fall, and the man simply went down and did not get back up, because he had spent the descent he was offered refusing to take it. That is the other ending. That is what the fight wins. The runner came within one exhausted morning of it. Now let me show you the other road, the one almost no one takes, because the contrast is where the entire truth of this lives. The change in the athlete does not begin with a triumph. It begins, as these things almost always do, with an exhaustion so complete that the fight simply becomes impossible. There is a morning when he cannot manufacture the upward push anymore, when the teaspoon finally falls from his hand, and instead of the catastrophe he has been told this would be, instead of sinking forever, something strange and quiet happens. He stops. He lets himself lie there without calling it failure. He lets the heaviness be heavy without immediately declaring war on it. And in that surrender, which everyone in his life would have called the moment he gave up, the descent finally gets to do what it came to do, because for the first time in 8 months it is not being shoved back up the stairs. The current, no longer fought, begins very slowly to move. What moves in him first is not hope. It is grief, real and overdue. And this is the part the fight had been protecting him from all along. Lying still at last, he begins to feel the thing under the depression, which was never weakness but loss, an ocean of it. He grieves the body that will never again be quite what it was. He grieves, more strangely, the boy he amputated, the one who was not fast, the one who liked to draw and to be quiet and to exist without earning it, the one he sent into exile so long ago he had forgotten the exile had a cost. The energy that pooled in his depth went looking in the dark for everything he had buried, and now that he has stopped fighting, it is bringing those buried things up into the light one at a time, and each one hurts, and each one as it surfaces gives a little of itself back to him. This is the underground work the heaviness was always doing. It was not subtracting him. It was excavating him, digging down past the single pillar to find the wider ground that the boy had paved over in his rush to win. There was a precise idea Jung carried about how this kind of buried movement surfaces, and it is one of the most useful things he ever offered, because it tells you where to look when the descent has begun. He believed that when the conscious life has become too one-sided, the psyche speaks up from underneath to correct it, often through the body, through symptoms, through the very heaviness the ego is so desperate to be rid of, and most insistently through dreams. And the athlete, in the weeks after he stops fighting, begins to dream. He dreams, again and again, of a house he grew up in, and in the dream there is a room at the back he had forgotten existed, a room full of things he made as a child, drawings and small carved animals, and a window looking out on a garden. And in the dream he feels, standing in that room, a peace he has not felt awake in 20 years. He wakes from it, not knowing what it means, only that it does not feel like the dream of a sick man. It feels like a message from a part of himself that the winning had locked away, a part that is, it turns out, still in there, still alive, still keeping the light on in a back room of the house, waiting to be remembered. The dream is the descent reporting back. It is the buried self saying, plainly, here is what you came down here to find. What the athlete is living, alone in a modern bedroom with the curtains drawn, is not new, and Jung's deepest reason for trusting the descent was that he had found its shape carved into the oldest stories humanity ever told. He called this kind of looking amplification, the practice of setting a private agony beside the great myths, to see that it is not a personal defect, but an ancient human passage with a known map. And the oldest map of all is the descent of Inanna, the queen of heaven in a story written down 4,000 years before anyone said the word depression. She chooses to go down into the underworld, and at each of its 7 gates she is made to surrender something, her crown, her jewels, her robe, until she arrives at the bottom, stripped of every emblem of who she was, naked and bowed low, and there she is struck down and hung on a hook like meat, a corpse in the dark. That is the part the comeback culture cannot bear. The queen does not fight her way through. She is undone completely. She hangs there, dead, until the smallest and humblest of helpers creep down to grieve over her, and only then, only after the total surrender of everything she had been at the top, does she rise, and rise changed, carrying an authority she could never have won by staying in the light. The runner stripped of his crown at the gate of a folded knee, lying undone in a dark room, while the helpers of grief creep up from his depths, is walking, without knowing the name of it, the exact road Inanna walked. And the same pattern wears 1,000 faces, the seed that has to be buried before it is anything but a stone. Persephone carried down to become a queen of the dark before she could return as the bringer of spring. Every initiation in every tradition that requires a symbolic death before the larger life can be conferred. Jung's point was never that the myth predicts your healing. It is that the depth of you already knows this road, that the descent is not a malfunction unique to your weakness, but the most human thing there is, and that countless souls before you have hung on the hook in the dark and come back up carrying something the unbroken will never hold. But there is a second jaw to this trap, and Jung was just as sharp about it as the first, because the descent has a danger of its own, and it is the opposite danger. If the first error is to fight the regression and never let it carry you down, the second error is to fall in love with the bottom and never come back up. There are people who descend and then mistake the descent itself for the destination, who wrap the heaviness around themselves like a blanket, who learn to call their stuckness depth and their refusal to climb out wisdom, and who stay down in the underground long after the work is done, because down there nothing is expected of them, and the terrifying business of building a new self can be indefinitely postponed. Jung had no romance about this. The descent is not the goal. It is a passage. The energy is supposed to go down, be reorganized, and come back up in a new form. And a regression that never turns back around is no longer in the service of the whole person. It has become a hiding place. The athlete has to make the descent, all the way to the bottom. And then he has to do the harder thing, which is to gather what he found there and begin, slowly, the climb back into a life, carrying the recovered pieces with him. Down is not where he lives. Down is where he goes to get the rest of himself. So there is a needle to thread here, and the threading of it is the whole art of surviving a true descent. You cannot fight the regression, or you exhaust yourself against your own cure, and you cannot surrender to it permanently, or it stops being a journey and becomes a grave. What Jung pointed toward, and what the athlete slowly learns to live, is a third posture entirely, which is neither fighting nor sinking, but accompanying, going down with the descent consciously, awake, paying attention to what surfaces, grieving what needs grieving, gathering what is offered, and then, when the bottom has given up its gift, beginning the deliberate work of carrying it back up. He starts, in his lowest months, to do the small thing the dream pointed at. He buys a sketchbook. He does not tell his father. He draws, badly at first, the way the exiled boy used to draw, and something in him that performance had never once touched begins, very faintly, to come back online. He is not getting his old self back. He is doing something far stranger and far more durable. He is becoming someone with more than one room. He is building wider. This is where the whole thing stops being about an injured athlete and becomes about the architecture of a real self, because what is being built down there in the dark is the thing he never had, a self that does not stand on a single pillar. Jung understood that the goal of a human life is not to be perfectly happy or relentlessly productive, but to become whole, to gather up all the disowned and exiled parts and integrate them into a personality wide enough to stand on more than one leg. The athlete's old self could win magnificently and do absolutely nothing else, and so the loss of winning was the loss of everything. The self he is assembling in the descent can win and can also lose and still exist, can perform and can also simply be, can run and can also sit quietly in a back room, making something with his hands for no reason other than that it is his. That self cannot be knocked down by a single badly planted step, because it is not balanced on a single step. The depression fought was the destruction of the only self he had. The depression honored became the construction of a self that can survive being human, which is the only self worth having. There is a fee for this, and no one warns you about it, and the athlete pays it in full. The fee is that he does not get the comeback story everyone wanted. He does not rise from the dark and return, restored, to the track, the crowd roaring, the equation reproven. That story, the one his father longed for, the one the culture sells as the only acceptable ending to a fall, would have been the fight winning, the old pillar rebuilt, the descent refused. What actually happens is quieter and infinitely larger. He does run again, eventually, but it is no longer the thing he is. It is one of several things he does, held in open hands by a man who now knows he would still be a man if it were taken. He has to give up the clean, triumphant narrative to receive the deeper thing, and the people around him, who can only see in the language of comebacks, will quietly think he settled, will think the injury took something from him that he never got back. They will be right that something did not come back. They will never understand that what did not come back was a cage. And here is where this stops being about an athlete on a bed and becomes about you, because you do not have to have lost a sport to know exactly this dark. You have had, or you are in, a season where the energy drained out of everything, where the things that used to move you went flat and gray, where you lay in your own version of that drawn curtain room while everyone around you and the harsh voice in your own head demanded to know what was wrong with you and why you would not just fight it. And you have probably been taught the same lie the athlete was taught, the lie that runs underneath the whole culture, which is that the heaviness is purely an enemy, that the only valid response is to defeat it as fast as possible and get back to the version of you that was productive and bright. I am not going to tell you that all suffering is secretly good, because that is not true, and it is a cruelty dressed as wisdom. Some darkness is just damage. But I am going to ask you to consider about your own gray season, the question almost no one asks. What if the energy did not vanish, but went down? What if it pulled back from your exhausted surface because the surface had become too narrow, too one-sided, built too completely on a single thing that had quietly stopped being true? What if the heaviness is not subtracting you, but excavating you, and your only job, the hardest job, is to stop bailing the cellar long enough to let the flood do its work? If that landed somewhere real, write it in the comments, not as a complaint, but as a line you are choosing to hold. I will stop fighting the descent and let it finish. Because that single decision to stop shoving the soul back up the stairs it is trying to walk down is the thing that turns a breakdown into a passage. And the passage, Jung insisted his whole life, is the only way through to a self that the smooth and unbroken never get to meet. The ones who were never made to descend stay shallow and bright and balanced on their single pillar. And they do beautifully, right up until the day the pillar is touched. The ones who go down, all the way down, and let the dark reorganize them, come back narrower in their certainties and infinitely wider in their ground, carrying parts of themselves they would never have found in the light. Let me show you the athlete one last time, 2 years on, because the arc is not complete without it. He runs, some mornings early, alone, with no clock and no crowd, for the simple animal pleasure of it, and it is good, and it is no longer everything. On the other mornings he does not run, and that is good too, which is the part that would have been unthinkable to the boy he was. There is a sketchbook on his table that is nearly full now. His father, who never quite understood what happened, has stopped asking when the real comeback is coming, partly because he has watched his son become, somehow, a person easier to be near, a person who is no longer performing his existence every waking second to earn a look. The scar on the knee is still there, pink fading to white. He runs his thumb over it sometimes, not with grief now and not with triumph, just with a kind of recognition. That was the door. The folding of that knee, which felt at the time like the end of him, was the only thing that ever could have stopped him long enough for the rest of him to catch up. You came in here looking at a young man pinned to a bed by a heaviness everyone around him was trying to destroy, and now you know why it would not lift. It would not lift because it was not finished. It would not lift because it was never the disease. It was the cure, wearing the disease's face, doing in the dark the one piece of work that the bright, narrow, winning life had made impossible. And the only thing standing between him and it was his own desperate, loving, exhausting refusal to let himself go down. So I will not tell you that your dark season is a gift, because that would be a lie. The same convenient lie the world keeps trying to sell to people who are suffering. The flatness, the grief, the months you cannot account for, they are not pretty, and they are not deserved, and no later meaning will make the lost time worth it. But I will tell you this, which is truer and harder. Not every step down is a fall. Sometimes the energy leaves the surface, not because you are failing, but because something underneath you has finished being true. And the psyche, wiser than the ego that runs your days, is taking the fuel back down to build the next thing out of sight. The descent you are most afraid of may be the one place a deeper self has ever been able to grow, and the floor you are so terrified of hitting may be the only ground in your whole life solid enough to finally build on. So stop clawing at the ceiling. Stop bailing the flood with a teaspoon. If the dark has come and will not lift, no matter how hard you fight it, consider, just for tonight, that it might not be your enemy. Lie still in it long enough to feel for the floor. And when your hand finds it, when you touch the solid thing at the bottom that the fall was always carrying you toward, you will understand what the athlete understood lying in that drawn curtain room, that the breakdown you fought with everything you had was the one thing that ever truly tried to save you, and that you only had to stop fighting long enough to let it finish. If this reached something in you, write it in the comments, that one line you are choosing to hold. I will let the descent finish its work. And if you want to go further into how the psyche speaks to you from underneath, into the strange and honest messages it sends right at the thresholds of your life, stay with me for what comes next in this series, where we turn to the letter your life keeps sending you. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.